What if I told you the most powerful country on Earth is being quietly choked by its northern neighbor? And the man who promised America first is terrified you'll find out. In the next 8 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why Canada is winning, and why the United States is falling behind. And here's the part Donald Trump doesn't want you to know. Trump is lying to you. He's been lying about American energy independence. He's been lying about who really needs who. He's been lying because the truth is so dangerous to his entire narrative that he can't afford for you to see the full map. So, if you're ready to see the truth they've been hiding, smash that like button, comment Canada strong, and let's dive in. Let's start with oil, because this is where the story gets interesting. In 2025, Canada supplied a record 60.88% of all US crude oil imports. That is nearly 4 million barrels every single day. Think about that number for a second. 4 million barrels every day, more than every other country in the world combined. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. It produces more than 13 million barrels of crude every day. It brags about being energy independent, and yet, somehow, it still needs Canada for 61% of its imported crude. Something doesn't add up, does it? Here is why. American crude is light and sweet. Canadian crude is heavy and sour. And here's the part no one in Washington wants to talk about. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, were built decades ago to process heavy crude. They cannot simply flip a switch and start processing American light crude. The US is the world's largest producer of light crude, but its refineries are hungry for heavy crude, and Canada is the only reliable, friendly source of that heavy crude left. Let me give you a specific number. Refineries in the Midwest process 2.8 million barrels per day of Canadian oil. That represents 73% of all crude inputs in that region. Overall, more than 70% of US imports of Canadian crude oil are refined in the Midwest. Take away Canadian crude, and those refineries start shutting down. Simple as that. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. US shale oil production is projected to peak in 2027 and then begin a steady decline. The US Energy Information Administration projects that after 2030, American oil production will decline faster through 2050 as the shale boom fades. Industry leaders are saying the same thing. The CEO of Occidental Petroleum told investors that the US will likely see peak production between 2027 and 2030, followed by decline. The CEO of ConocoPhillips gave a similar timeline. So here is the uncomfortable truth. As American production declines, Canadian production becomes more, not less, essential. Here is the question Washington doesn't want to answer. Which American refineries shut down first if the pipeline corridor from Canada is ever politically or physically interrupted? How many jobs disappear? How much does gasoline cost at the pump? And the bigger question, how can the country that claims global energy dominance still require its northern neighbor for the majority of its imported crude? The answer is simple. Because the myth of American energy independence is exactly that, a myth. Now, let's move from oil to something even more important for the future, critical minerals. The United States has a list of minerals it considers critical to national security. There are 60 of them. Canada holds economically viable deposits of more than half of them. Canada is the only Western country that possesses all the primary raw materials needed for advanced lithium-ion batteries within its own borders. Let that sink in. The only Western country with everything needed to build the batteries that will power the electric vehicle revolution and the defense systems of tomorrow. And here is the irony. The United States has all these minerals too. But American mining projects remain stalled in permitting and environmental litigation. In the US, it can take 10 to 15 years to permit a mining project. Meanwhile, Canada is actively developing mines and processing capacity. G7 countries have invested $6.4 billion into 26 critical mineral projects across Canada. And here is the part that will blow your mind. The United States is writing checks to accelerate Canadian critical minerals projects. The U.S. Defense Production Act is funding Canadian mines. The U.S. is paying for Canadian mining infrastructure. Why? Because America's own regulatory system has become so dysfunctional that it cannot get its own mines built. It needs Canada to do what it cannot do for itself. Here is the question. What happens to American electric vehicle production and defense manufacturing if Canadian critical mineral output scales up, while American mines remain stuck in permitting purgatory? And the even bigger question, why is the United States paying Canada to develop its mining industry instead of fixing its own regulatory paralysis? The answer: because Canada is the only reliable, trusted source of these minerals outside of China. And everyone in Washington knows it. Now, let's talk about electricity, because this is where the leverage gets real. In June 2026, the Champlain Hudson Power Express transmission line began delivering clean hydroelectric power from Quebec directly to New York City. This 339-mile transmission line is one of New York's largest infrastructure projects in 50 years. It delivers 10.4 terawatt-hours of clean energy per year to the New York metro area. That meets up to 20% of New York City's electricity needs. It can power 1 million homes. Let me put that in perspective. 1 out of every 5 lights in New York City is powered by Quebec hydropower. And it's not just New York. Hydro-Quebec also exports significant power to New England. A 25-year contract will deliver 9.5 terawatt-hours annually to Boston. The total exports to New York and New England combined: 20 terawatt-hours of clean electricity every year. These interconnections were built to help northeastern states meet decarbonization targets they cannot easily achieve with domestic generation alone. New York City has had to rely more on gas-fired plants since the closure of the Indian Point nuclear plant. Quebec hydropower helps fill that gap. But here is the catch. Quebec controls the flow. During extreme cold in January 2026, Hydro-Quebec temporarily suspended energy exports to Massachusetts just 1 week after inaugurating its new line. They needed the power for their own citizens. Here is the question. What happens to the Northeast U.S. power grid if political tensions escalate? What happens to electricity prices during the coldest weeks of winter if Quebec decides to keep its power for itself? Who ultimately controls the pace of decarbonization for the most densely populated corridor in America? The answer is not in Washington, it's in Quebec. Now, let's zoom way up north, because this is where the next great geopolitical battle is going to be fought. The Northwest Passage threads entirely through Canada's Arctic archipelago. Canada asserts full sovereignty over these waters as internal, historic waters. The United States has never accepted this claim. The U.S. maintains that the Northwest Passage constitutes an international strait with unrestricted transit rights. In 1985, the U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker Polar Sea sailed through the passage without seeking Canadian permission. The voyage provoked considerable furor in Canada. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. Accelerating ice loss is making regular commercial summer transits viable through the Northwest Passage. This route shortens Asia-Europe voyages by approximately 7,000 kilometers compared with the Panama Canal. 7,000 kilometers shorter. That means less fuel, less time, lower costs. The Northwest Passage could become the new Suez Canal of the Arctic. Here is the question. When commercial shipping begins in earnest, who sets the rules? Who sets the safety standards? Who collects the tolls? And here is the bigger question. Will the United States accept Canadian sovereignty claims or risk direct confrontation to keep the passage internationalized? Remember, Russia and China are actively developing parallel Arctic capabilities. Any US-Canada rupture over sovereignty or access hands strategic initiative to rivals. The United States has a choice: respect Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, or risk turning a friendly neighbor into a strategic adversary at the exact moment when great power competition in the Arctic is heating up. So, here is where we end. You have been told that America is self-sufficient. You have been told that Canada is just a sidekick. You have been told that the United States doesn't need anyone. The truth is this: 61% of American oil imports come from Canada. 20% of New York City's electricity comes from Quebec. Canada holds every battery metal America needs for its EV and defense future. And the new global shipping shortcut runs through Canadian waters. The United States cannot survive without Canada. Full stop. The question is not whether America needs Canada. The question is, what will America do when it finally realizes the truth? Because Canada knows. Canada has always known. And now, so do you.